Okay, it has come time for us to review our very last study guide for this course. Please remember that while I will cover the urinary and reproductive systems in this packet, your final exam includes questions from your entire course. There will be an emphasis on the newer material, so one I cover in this study guide, but you also want to be prepared to answer to questions about rest of the course. So have those study guides to support you as well. So let's start with the urinary system. Here we see a really nice drawing of a kidney cut along the coronal plane. We see various structures here. Remember, there is a rich blood flow into and out of the kidney because that is one of the big functions that it serves, filtering the blood. So we see our renal artery and renal vein. From this area on the medial aspect, we also see the ureter coming out. This is indicated with letter B and pointed out in question 1. And it will run all the way to the urinary bladder where the urine is then held at. You may recall from seeing a kidney during the dissection that it had this nice, smooth, shiny outer surface. And this is because it is enclosed inside a fibrous capsule, as indicated by letter F and captured in question 4. As you recall, kidney had both cortex, so outer region, as well as the medulla, so the middle region. And within the medulla, we saw these triangular structures, often of a darker tissue. They are what we call as renal pyramids. This is indicated as letter D on the diagram and captured in question 2. And between these structures, we see a continuation of a paler tissue coming in from the cortex. These are called renal columns, and they are indicated with letter C and in question 3 on this page. We are ready to move on to a page 2, so let's do just that. And here we see this very nice drawing of a nephron. You may remember that we drew it together in a class as well, and that version that I provided for you was a little more simplified. That is good. We built from simpler to complex. You may recall that nephron was really the business end of the kidney. It is here that we see the physiological processes taking place, filtering the blood and producing what will become urine. And we see blood coming in through afferent arteriole, shown as letter B and question 9. And then we have this capillary tuft, which was known as glomerulus. That is indicated here as letter O and also addressed in question 10. From there, we have efferent arteriole coming out, and it will follow along to the rest of the nephron for its journey. As you may recall, I used an analog of changing mind as materials moved in and out of the nephron until we have the final composition of what will become the urine. So having that efferent arteriole running along there is going to be important. But let's return back to the glomerulus. This was a bundle of capillaries where we have small holes through which some of the contents of the blood that we want to get rid of can leak out, while others that we want to keep, like red blood cells, stay inside because they are too large to pass through these openings. It is almost like it would be a sieve. And now this glomerulus is surrounded by a glomerular capsule. This is shown as letter A on this drawing. And and addressed with question 7 on this worksheet. It surrounds the glomerulus from all sides except from the top, where the vessels entered and exited. So what we see here is a cross-section of it. Really, it looks more like glomerular capsule is sometimes also called as a Bowman's capsule, but that is a little more old-fashioned term to use. Then leaving the glomerular capsule, we see this thicker tube that comes out. It is indicated as letter M here, and we see on question 8. It was called proximal convoluted tubule. We will have another convoluted tubule later. Then from the proximal convoluted tubule, we get a more narrow tube as a continuation. This is indicated here as letter J, and we see it in question 5. It is the nephron loop. This is also sometimes known as the loop of Henle. It then loops back up and continues as distal convoluted tubule, which opens up eventually to the collecting duct, as shown with question 6 and letter K. In fact, multiple nephrons empty to a single collecting duct. These then lead into a minor calyx. Now, on the next page, we have some filling the blank questions. Let's work our way through those. Question 11, we saw earlier that the site where the renal arteries and renal veins exited the kidney and ureter coming from there as well. Well, this area on the medial aspect of the kidney is called renal height. Then question 12, remember that the kidney has outer cortex and medulla, which was the middle area, just like we were discussing the brain. Question 13 explores the structure within this area called medulla. We saw that these darker triangular tissue areas, they were renal pyramids. And between those were the renal columns. These are paler tissue continuing from the cortex. And question 14 reminds us of the major vessels carrying blood from the abdominal area, aorta, to the kidney. And that was a renal artery. Remember, arteries were marked in red. Then, as we saw just a while ago, the nephrons are both functional and structural unit of the kidney. This is question 15. We just reviewed that beautiful diagram of those. Now, question 16. Keeping up with our earlier review of nephron, we recall that glomerulus, so the capillary tuft of a nephron, received its blood from an afferent arteriole. Question 17 gives us a chance to see those movements of the fluids in and out of the nephron at various stages. So filtration between the glomerulus and glomerular capsule. Reabsorption takes place especially at the proximal convoluted tubule, and secretion more at the distal convoluted tubule. What was produced, which then enters the collecting duct, is essentially urine. Question 18 reminds us about the fact that the pH of urine is around 6. But remember, there was quite a lot of variation with this. Then thinking back to our very first diagram of this session, we recall that it was the ureters that carried urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. We see that as a question 19. Then, if you recall, the ureters joined the urinary bladder at the very bottom. So we had these two tubes opening there. And the third opening is that for the urethra that carried urine from the bladder to the external world. And if you imagine lines connecting these three structures there at the bottom of the urinary bladder, These form a triangular shape, so that is what we refer to when we talk about trigon seen in question 20. Question 21 reminds us that there were two sphincters that controlled the process of expelling urine through urethra. The internal one is involuntary, and the more external one is voluntary. We train these when we grow to hold our urine early in life. In some older people, for example, we see that we lose the ability to control these. As you recall, the process of urination was called micturition. And it was a complex process where several different processes needed to align to take place at the same time for it to take place. That is our question 22. And as I alluded earlier, question 23 shows that when we lose the ability to voluntarily control the outer urethral sphincter, we have a case of incontinence. And diabetes insipidus was characterized by frequent urination, where we expel large amounts of very dilute urine. This we see in question 24. Finally, on question 25, I have a clinical example for us. An untreated strep infection in childhood can lead into a kidney infection where the glomerular filters are clogged by antigen-antibody complexes. That was known as a post-strep glomerulonephritis. Remember, itis referring to the inflammation. Okay, we are ready to move on to the next page. Here, we see a diagram of the male reproductive system as a cross-section of the pelvis cut on a mid-sagittal plane. So the primary male sex organs were the testes. These are indicated here as letter K and captured in question 26. Resting on top of them are the epididymis, shown with letter J. Then we get to the vas deferens, or it is sometimes called ductus deferens, or deferentia, which is this long tube that loops over the urinary bladder to the back of it, where it dilates into a structure known as ampulla. Right next to it is seminal vesicle, which would be letter F on this diagram. Secretions from here provide a boost of energy for the sperm cell, which have now swam half of their journey at this stage, so it is well needed. Then ejaculatory duct continues, shown as letter G on this picture, and also captured in question 29. This is the last part of this duct system where the urinary and reproductive systems are still separate. These ducts continue through the prostate gland, as shown with letter A here. And recall, excessive prostate growth was something that affected many older men. That could cause these tubes to be constricted and urine no longer flows through as easily, so emptying the bladder becomes harder. And we also often see issues that impact sex life. So from this point, where both urinary and reproductive systems share the tubes, we talk about the urethra. This is shown as letter C and also captured in question 30. And we continue the journey and see the third gland that contributes to these secretions. It is the small gland here indicated with letter I and seen in question 28. This is the bulbourethral gland. The rest of the path goes through the penis, where we see erectile tissue, helping to insert the penis into the female reproductive system to deliver the sperm. On the next page, we see a similar diagram for the female reproductive system. So a nice mid-sagittal plane view of the pelvis. The primary sex organs of the female are going to be the ovaries. These are indicated by letter B here, and also seen in question 32. Remember, rather interestingly, these were not directly physically connected to the next part, but the egg cell was shed the pelvic cavity from where it's rescued by the fimbriae that sweep it from there and direct towards the uterine tube. This tube is indicated with letter E and captured in question 31 as well. The other name that we see sometimes used for it is the fallopian tube. Well, the uterine tube leads into the uterus, which we see as G on this diagram. There were three parts to it: fundus on the top, body, which was the major part, and at the bottom, partially extending into the vagina, cervix. I think that cervix would be shown here as a letter D. This is from where we collect the tissue sample for a pap smear test. We can also see on this diagram also the inner lining of the uterus, known as endometrium, shown with letter C and in question 35. This appears and thickens in preparation for the potential implantation of a fertilized egg cell. But if the egg does not get fertilized, this structure too gets shed as part of the monthly cycle. And finally, we see the opening of the vagina as a letter I and in question 34. And for making certain we know where it is, letter H symbolizes the clitoris seen in question 33. Now, we finish this page and continue into the next page with a few fill-in-the-blank questions. Let's do those. Question 36. The gonads were the primary sex organs. All other parts of the reproductive system would be then considered as accessory structures. Male gonads were the testes and female ones ovaries. These have a twofold function: to produce sex cells known as gametes, sperm and egg, and to produce sex hormones. So here we see a connection to our endocrine system. Question 37 takes us back to the tube-like structure of the male reproductive system. Sitting on top of the testes was the epidermis, which was like this coiled tube there. This is where the sperm went to be stored and mature. Question 38 reminds us that the sperm, which was swimming, needed a boost of energy, and this was in part provided by the fructose-rich secretions. Remember, we talked about this with the seminal vesicle. Question 39 points out the external male genitalia. The end of the penis that enlarges is known as the glans penis. Then, as we see in question 40, the skin sac that houses the testes outside the body was known as scrotum. This was important because the ideal temperature for sperm was slightly cooler than the human body temperature. And as we know, if it gets too cold, we can just pull the testes and scrotum closer. Let's finish off with the last page. Here we see question 41. We saw in ovaries these tiny structures where the egg cell developed, and these were called follicles. Question 42, the ducts or tubules that are responsible for receiving the ovulated egg cell and provide a site of fertilization are the tubes. Question 43, we talked about these finger-like tiny projections that rescued the egg cell that had been shed to the pelvic space and guided it to the uterine tube. These were fimbriae. We saw that there were three parts to the uterus. The roof of uterus, known as the fundus, the major part known as the body, and the final part that partially protruded into the vagina known as cervix. That is what we were asked in question 44. This, as I mentioned earlier, where we went to collect a tissue sample from as part of the cervical smear. Question 45 reminds us about that innermost layer of the uterus known as endometrium. This is what thickened as the monthly cycle progressed, and if there was no fertilization, then it was shed. Question 46 addresses just that the fertilized egg cell will then implant to the endometrium. Then, question 47, Mons pubis referred to this rounded area overlying the pubic symphysis, and it was made of adipose tissue. In question 48, we see the hormone FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone. This does what it says in the tin. It drives the development of a follicle, so egg cell and the tissue immediately around it. Now, when an egg gets fertilized, it gets called a zygote. We see this in question 49. Question 50 notes that the days 1 to 5 of the menstrual cycle were known as the menstrual phase. Question 51, when preparing to give birth, hormone called relaxin helps to loosen the pelvic ligaments and the pubic symphysis. Question 52, this was part of a series of steps that takes place during the labor. Question 53 addresses the first stage of this larger process, and it was the dilation stage. Finally, question 54 reminds us about menopause, which was characterized by a full calendar year of lack of menstrual cycle at the end of a female reproductive age. This brings us to the end of this study guide. It has been fun going through these with you. Thanks for a great semester.